Welcome to Novara Live. Coming up, Donald Trump has begged allies to help him reopen the Straits of Hormuz. They don't seem keen. Also, we speak to political scientist Annelle Sheline about whether Donald Trump has bitten off more than he can chew, and a White House advisor warns that Israel may be prepared to use its nuclear weapons against Iran. I'm Michael Walker, and I'm joined by Ash Sarkar. Great to have you in the studio today.
You know what? It was great until before we went live, you started trolling me about Tottenham Hotspur's performance in the Premier League. So I'm this close to walking out.
Also, there was an exciting moment there. I don't know. Look at this. We're both in the same room. We've got a third camera. We've got a wide shot. I've been begging Gary for a wide shot for months, and he's finally got around to it. He's blowing me a kiss in the background there. If you'd like to support our work, if you think do we deserve a fourth camera? Well, if you want us to get a fourth camera, you're probably going to have to sign up at novaramedia.com/support. Of course, you can also listen to the show on Spotify and Apple. Don't forget to let us know what you think in the comments. The illegal U.S.-Israeli war on Iran has spread violence throughout the Middle East, from Oman to Iraq and Cyprus to Qatar. Almost every country in the region has now been hit by projectiles from one of the Free State actors in the war. Its economic impact is already spiraling much further, though. And that's all down to the blockage of the Strait of Hormuz. Over the past 2 weeks, Iran has struck at least 16 ships in and around the strait, which transports 15% of the world's oil supply, as well as even higher proportions of fertilizer and liquid natural gas. The strait is now effectively closed, with ship owners, crews and insurers refusing to risk the journey. And that means that oil, a lot of it, isn't making it onto international markets, raising the price of the essential fuel. Before the US and Israel launched their illegal attack on Iran, around 23 million barrels of oil exited the Gulf each day, and that's around a fifth of the world's global oil supply. Once the bombing began, that fell by 97%. If those supply drops have caused a dramatic increase, or those supply drops have caused a dramatic increase in the cost of oil, with prices rising by 50% since late February. A week ago, that price reached nearly $120 per barrel, at one point before falling below 100. That's the highest they've been since the last oil shock, when Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022. Today, they've opened over 100 again, with some analysts saying they could hit $200 a barrel in the coming weeks and months if, of course, the Strait of Hormuz stays closed. Now, of course, those price rises will be passed on. So diesel prices have risen by 18 pence a litre since the start of the war, with petrol prices going up by 10 pence a litre at some forecourts. So anything that needs to be transported anywhere will go up in price, which is pretty much everything. It isn't just petrol and diesel, though. The price of liquid natural gas has also risen dramatically, with 20% of the world's supply coming from the Gulf. And urea, which is a vital nitrogen component of fertilizers, derived as a byproduct of liquid natural gas production and exported by the Gulf states, has also surged in price, just in time for Northern Hemisphere farmers' spring planting. So that threatens an additional shock to global food supplies if farmers can't get their fertilizer in time, or it becomes too expensive to buy. It's all, of course, a massive mess with the potential to get even bigger, and it's one that US President Donald Trump and his cabinet don't seem to have considered in advance, which means now they're scrambling. On Sunday, Donald Trump took to Truth Social to demand help opening the strait, posting this. Many countries, especially those who are affected by Iran's attempted closure of the Hormuz Strait, will be sending warships in conjunction with the United States of America to keep the strait open and safe. We have already destroyed 100% of Iran's military capability, but it's easy for them to send a drone or two, drop a mine, or deliver a close-range missile somewhere along or in this waterway, no matter how badly defeated they are. Hopefully China, France, Japan, South Korea, the UK, and others that are affected by this artificial constraint will send ships to the area so that the Hormuz Strait will no longer be a threat by a nation that has been totally decapitated. In the meantime, the United States will be bombing the hell out of the shoreline and continually shooting Iranian boats and ships out of the water. One way or the other, we will soon get the Hormuz Strait open, safe, and free, signed from the president. None of those countries, though, are particularly interested in getting involved, mainly because they didn't have much to do with the starting of this war. If there is a logic, Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt tried to lay it out this morning.
Why should other countries that were consulted about this war, that are involved in this war, now put their troops in harm's way in the Strait of Hormuz?
Because these other countries are benefiting greatly from the United States military taking out the threat of Iran. The rogue Iranian regime has long not just posed a threat to the United States of America, but of course to our Gulf and Arab partners in the region. As you see, I believe Iran has struck more than 300 civilian targets in the Gulf region. If you think about Europe, their ballistic missile capability that the United States military is currently wiping out was a direct and imminent threat to our European allies as well as our bases in the region, which is why President Trump took this action in the first place. So these countries are absolutely benefiting from ensuring that Iran can never obtain a nuclear weapon. This is something not just the United States, but the entire Western world has agreed with for many, many years. So I think the president is absolutely right to call on these countries to do more to help the United States to reopen the Strait of Hormuz so that we can stop this terrorist regime from restricting the free flow of energy. And the fact that they are doing so just underscores why President Trump needed to take this action in the first place.
If by benefiting she means inflation, that would make some sense. I don't think anyone else in the world is thinking that they are really benefiting from this war, other than, I suppose, Israel, who are seeing this as an opportunity to take out one of their rivals who they've had their sights on for a very long time. In an interview with the Financial Times, Trump turned the temperature up even higher. So he told the paper that NATO faces a very bad future if its members don't come to the US's aid in Iran. And he added this: "We have a thing called NATO. We've been very sweet. We didn't have to help them with Ukraine. Ukraine is thousands of miles away from us, but we helped them. Now we'll see if they help us, because I've long said that we'll be there for them, but they won't be there for us, and I'm not sure they'd be there. The UK might be considered the number one ally, the longest serving, etc." And when I asked, I love that. And when I asked for them to come, they didn't want to come. And as soon as we basically wiped out the danger capacity from Iran, they said, "Oh, well, we'll send 2 ships. And I said, "We need these ships before we win, not after we win. I've long said that NATO is a one-way street." NATO is a defensive alliance. Of course, there is no obligation for member states to support any other member if they start a war of choice. That's sort of not what Article 5 is about. An attack on one means that you're all obliged to defend that one. This is not that. Countries aren't playing ball either. So Germany, France, Japan and the UK have all ruled out sending immediate military support to the Strait. This was British Prime Minister Keir Starmer this morning.
We have been clear and consistent in our objectives throughout this conflict. First, we will protect our people in the region. Second, while taking the necessary action to defend ourselves and our allies, we will not be drawn into the wider war. And third, we will keep working towards a swift resolution that brings security and stability back to the region and stops the Iranian threat to its neighbours.
Starmer also said that it would take a negotiation agreement to reopen the Strait of Hormuz, and that the UK was working with its allies to agree a viable plan. In the meantime, the government is preparing for tough economic times ahead, and that includes capping energy prices until the end of June, making it a legal requirement for energy suppliers to pass budget savings onto consumers, and putting off a fuel duty rise. And Starmer also said this:
"I'm announcing immediate support for vulnerable heating oil customers today, providing £53 million for those households that are most exposed."
So it's people who use heating oil to heat their homes. So I think a significant minority of people. I think it may be 10 to 15%, something like that. This afternoon, Trump shared these thoughts about the UK.
2 weeks ago, I said, why don't you send some ships over? And he really didn't want to do it. I said, you don't want to do it. We've been with you. You're our oldest ally. And we spend a lot of money on, NATO and all of these things to protect you. I mean, we're protecting them. We're working with them on Ukraine. Ukraine's thousands of miles away, separated by a vast ocean. We don't have to do that, but we did it. Well, Biden did it. I mean, I have to be honest with you. Biden got taken to the cleaners. But we worked with them in Ukraine. We don't need to work with them in Ukraine. And then they tell us that we have a mine ship around, and they don't want to do it. I think it's terrible. No, I was very surprised. I told him, we requested 2 aircraft carriers, which they had, and he didn't really want to do it. And then right after the war essentially ended, meaning they were obliterated, he said, I would like to send the aircraft carriers. I said, I don't need them after the war has ended and won. I need it before the war. So I was very upset not upset, I was not happy with the UK. I think they'll be involved, yeah, maybe. But they should be involved enthusiastically.
We should be involved enthusiastically. I mean, Starmer's not really enthusiastic about anything, to be honest. But, I mean, is this credit where it's due? These other countries have often, I mean, especially the UK, have slavishly followed the United States into wars of choice. And now that's not happening. People are saying, this is your problem, Donald Trump. You started it. We're not, we don't want to put our ships in harm's way.
I mean, obviously, it's a good decision on the part of Starmer to not get fully involved in the war with Iran, right? Obviously, it's a good idea. But whether or not this half in, half out approach that he's taken, where there's been some support and some use of UK military infrastructure to aid the American war effort, whether that will be enough to prevent the kind of violent blowback that we experienced during and following the war on terror remains to be seen. And for me, a salient comparison here, ironically enough, is thinking about the use of Afghanistan as, a training hub by Al-Qaeda. It was allowed by the Taliban. Now, that was then the reason that was invoked to go to war with Afghanistan, the only time that Article 5 of NATO has been invoked in its history, which then pulled us into it. So if you were part of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, or you were a sort of commander of its overseas operations and its work with armed militant groups around the world, would that half in, half out of we let you use some of our stuff, but not really, would that fly? So that's something that we still don't know about. An interesting thing for me is how Trump has perhaps fatally undermined the other strong-arm tactic he's been using to get countries into line, which is the punitive program of tariffs. So if you're Keir Starmer and you're highly vulnerable to retaliatory tariffs, and so you've put in all this work to placate and mollify Trump, only for the Strait of Hormuz to be closed, with all these knock-on consequences for liquefied natural gas, oil, fertilizers, and, you're staring down the barrel of either, sclerotic growth or perhaps even recession, maybe the tariffs don't matter so much. So you go, okay, I can make a calculation that it's worse for the British economy and worse for my immediate political ambitions to prolong a war or to participate in an unpopular one than for Trump to introduce some kind of retaliatory tariff regime against us. For me, there's an interesting thing here, which is how does this war fit in with the rest of Trump's program? I mean, in some ways, quite badly.
Yeah, I mean, it does seem to... I mean, he threatened tariffs against Spain. He said he would end all trade with Spain, which of course doesn't make sense because trade is in the EU, so you can't have a trade policy specifically towards Spain.
No more chorizo. It doesn't matter how delicious it is. No more chorizo for us.
I know, that's brave for a guy like that. But I mean, I think this does seem like it is working against his other ambitions. It doesn't make any real sense.
I mean, the thing is that he might go, okay, well, actually... this might weaken the program of tariffs, but if you're looking at, a world in which a 3-degree temperature rise is nailed on, 4-degree temperature rise is nailed on, and you're anticipating intense competition for resources, including oil, including food, et cetera, then if you're Trump, you might go, well, this still makes sense, even if it undermines this thing. So I don't want to say, it's wholly irrational. I just say that it's incoherent with the other strong-arm tactics. I think the idea that this is because
Trump is taking climate change seriously, I think you might be giving him too much credit.
Nah, I think that everyone's doing it. I think that Putin's after Ukraine for the wheat. Trump's after Iran to limit the supply of oil to his enemies and opponents or to control it for himself.
Maybe. I think he's just an idiot. But let's... go on to, tariffs is an interesting one because he has been obsessed with that since the 80s. And it turns out he's been obsessed with this small island we're going to discuss now since the 80s as well. And before he begged other countries to help to reopen the strait, Trump had a bright idea for unilateral action that he presumably hoped could hasten the end of this war. So he bombed Karg Island. Karg Island, you've probably heard of it by now. It's located about 16 miles off Iran's shore in the Persian Gulf. It's not a massive island. It's just 5 miles long, 3 miles wide, but it's of enormous economic and strategic value to Tehran. That's because around 90% of Iran's oil exports pass through the island's terminal. So it's packed with very valuable infrastructure. Now, as far as I understand, this is because the water isn't deep enough just on Iran's border. So they need to go to this island. Over the weekend, though, the US bombed it, striking more than 90 targets across the island. US Central Command says all of those targets were military, that the oil infrastructure was left intact. But according to US President Donald Trump, that's very much just for now.
We attacked Karg Island, and we left just the one little area standing, and the standing part is where they have the pipes, all the oil pipes come in. And we can do that on 5 minutes notice. We have it all locked and loaded and ready to go if we want to do it. But we chose not to do it. I chose not to do it yet. We'll see what happens.
In a telephone interview with NBC, Trump also said he might strike the island a few more times, quote, just for fun. Targeting the country's oil infrastructure would obviously be a strike against much-needed civilian infrastructure, leaving the Iranian people without a vital source of income, even under a new government, if that were to be put in place. It would also, of course, I think this is probably the bigger reason the US isn't doing it, provoke a strong reaction from the Iranians against the energy infrastructure of their Gulf neighbors, and which they've currently largely left intact. So they've been stopping boats going through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a temporary measure, but they haven't really been sort of bombing the oil terminals, which would be more permanent and which would be seen as more escalatory. So what is Trump thinking? This surprised me. Karg Island appears to have been an obsession of Donald Trump for decades. So in a 1988 interview with Polly Toynbee, of all people, Trump said this: "I'd be harsh on Iran. They've been beating us psychologically, making us look a bunch of fools. One bullet shot at our men or ships and I'd do a number on Karg Island. I'd go in and take it. Iran can't even beat Iraq, yet they push the United States around. It'd be good for the world to take them on." Actually, I hate to admit it, but I hadn't heard of Karg Island before this war began. Trump, in a way, was ahead of the game. He was talking about this in the 80s.
You mentioned this about tariffs, is that there is a way in which Trump, for all of his chaos and incoherence, has been remarkably consistent on some issues, right? So one is this idea that tariffs can somehow magically replace income tax. And then the other is Karg Island. And I think that both of these things kind of reflect his worldview. And there are these continuities between how he's conducted himself in the world of business to how he applies that to international politics, is that he believes that you should always bring the other side squealing to the table. So whether they're friend or foe, right? And in the world of business, he also has a terrible record for how he treats his so-called friends and partners. You exert maximum force, choke the life out of them, and then you see if a deal can be made. And I think that that's the logic behind the tariff regime. And obviously, there's the taco element. Trump always chickens out, being pressured by Wall Street, being pressured by some of the financial interests within his own administration. But I think that's the idea that's in his head. And so while as we've just said, there are these aspects of his foreign policy which don't cohere with each other, they certainly cohere with his view of how negotiation and deal-making takes place.
Yes, it's interesting how, because this happened on Friday night, that Karg Island was bombed. And everyone, obviously the markets are closed over the weekend. So everyone was sort of saying he's done it on Friday night because he doesn't want there to be an immediate market reaction. And everyone was expecting that when the markets sort of reopened on Monday morning, or I think it's late Sunday night if you're in East Asia, that it would sort of rocket because this was seen as a massive escalation. Obviously, the Karg Island is key to the oil supply because Iran is a big exporter of oil, and people assume that this would sort of invite retaliation against the Gulf oil infrastructure. But it hasn't really moved. So it's slightly above 100 now. But it's sort of like, I saw sort of stories in The Guardian this morning that say oil price hiked again on the back of Karg, and it's like it went up 1.3% and then it came back down again. So it seems like the markets are a little bit complacent. They seem to think this is going to be over soon. I don't really I thought that the oil traders were supposed to be quite serious people who were very alert to these risks, but it seems remarkably complacent that this kind of stuff is happening and it's not really budging.
I mean, look, how much of it is, well, we priced this in, the signals for a war have been coming for a long time, that's one part of it. And then the other part of it is how much is a bet on taco, right? How much is a bet that Trump has started a war? He likes things that can be dealt with quickly, that he can get out, as cleanly as possible. That might be the thing that's happening. So we'll see.
Yeah.
We'll see.
I mean, we should say, obviously, the oil is much more expensive than it was before the war started, but sort of each escalatory element doesn't seem to be adding much more. It was $70 sort of at the start of the month. So it has increased considerably. And if your energy bills go, it's going to be because of Trump.
I mean, the other thing to add is that you've got two things, right? One is that you've got reserves being put into circulation, right? So there's a degree to which the price is going to be insulated by that. And then the second thing is that we haven't yet seen China enter onto the international market for oil yet, right? So obviously the trade relationship between Iran and China is really, really significant, particularly for oil. And so when China's like, okay, well, we need some, that might be something that you see having.
How do you mean? So what do you mean when China comes? Because China's buying oil at the moment, right?
No, what I mean is that because when you've got the thing of reserves, right? China also has reserves.
Right. Yeah.
And so when you have those reserves being stress tested,
yeah,
and you have more competition on the international markets for oil supplies, that might be the point in which you see like $150 a barrel.
I'd imagine it's coming. The blowback from the Iran war is still currently most visible in the Gulf. In the early hours of Monday morning, Dubai airport was hit by a drone strike that's reported to have set a jet fuel storage site ablaze, causing all flights in and out of the airport to be cancelled as the site continued to blaze after the sun rose, which you can see there. Mid-air flights were turned around or rerouted. There are also people on social media tweeting about their experiences. So a lawyer travelling to Dubai tweeted this: "I am on Emirates EK 010 from London Gatwick to Dubai. We were just about a couple of hours from landing in Dubai when the flight had to turn back to Gatwick due to the airport closure. We are now on our way back to London after getting so close to Dubai." Obviously not a good advert for Emirates Airlines. Do you really want to book a ticket if you might have to get, there's a considerable chance you're going to have to turn around? Do you want to get on a flight to a place where missiles are landing, I suppose is the bigger question. So far, the UAE says it's had 1,800 missiles and drones fired into its territory in a fortnight. The country's Minister for International Cooperation, though, has given an interview to Australia's ABC where she blamed just one actor in the conflict.
It's been pretty unprecedented what's happened and almost unhinged, I would say, to have Iran lash out at the very people who've been calling for de-escalation, who've been calling for this war to never actually even start, which has really taken us by surprise. We've borne the brunt of most of the missiles and drone attacks, and it's really quite surprising for us that Iran has taken such an irrational path to fight the Gulf states and act in this quite unlawful, quite unacceptable manner.
What does the war mean for agreements reached between the UAE, the United States and even Israel, things like the Board of Peace, the pledge of investment in the United States, the Abraham Accords? How does it change the dynamics?
It doesn't. It doesn't. If anything, we are doubling down on our friends. We are further cementing the strong ties that bind us. Moments of crisis won't falter the trajectory that we are in, which is built on partnership and mutual respect.
That was a minister from the UAE saying they're basically doubling down on the relationship with the United States and Israel, saying this is all Iran's fault. They're pissed off that they're getting hit. British Airways has cancelled flights to the Gulf until at least May, which seems quite significant. I mean, I suppose most flights going in and out are the Emirates, because it is a big hub airport, which their sort of signature carrier will use. Some influencers in the UAE are pushing back, though, against the narrative that, Dubai is a dangerous place, that it's over, that it's a war zone. One of them is Ian Miles Chong. You might have seen him on Twitter before. He's got 1.2 million followers. He's a right-wing Trump supporter, a bit like Isabel Oakeshott, actually, who tweets about how immigrants are taking over America. Obviously, she talks about it with the UK whilst living in Dubai.
Hey guys, does it look like this is a war zone? I'm told this is a war zone. According to social media, this is a war zone. I'm just having some nice food here, okay? In the Mall of the Emirates, reporting live from a quote-unquote war zone, because some idiot decided that that this whole place is a war zone to get some clicks. So don't believe everything you read on social media. It's just complete nonsense. Dubai's fine, everything's fine. Abu Dhabi's fine. This was just there like a couple of days ago. Nothing's changed. Guys, it's fine. What the hell?
Now, obviously, that's the kind of video that you are allowed to upload from the UAE at the moment. There are people who've been arrested for sort of filming where rockets have landed, where drones have landed. So, we're not necessarily getting the full picture from there. But I mean, is Dubai over? It had an image of being a safe place. You could go as an influencer or a tech worker or a lawyer, make lots of money, have a nice quality of life. Now, your plane might get turned back because the drone has struck the fuel depot at the airport. I
mean, just look at the Dubai real estate market. So
I always do. I check most mornings.
I always do because all of my investments. So on Friday, when I was writing the Cortado, about 20% of the value had sort of been wiped off. And now it's looking like it might even be as high as a third. And lots of people are hoping it's going to be a temporary blip. I wonder if that's going to be the case, because it took decades and decades to cultivate this image of Dubai in particular as a safe haven for Westerners. It was a really interesting thing that happened in the 1960s, which is when oil is discovered in the United Arab Emirates. And quite early on, the sheikh class are worried. They're worried about, well, what happens to us when the oil runs out? And you can see why, right? There's the period of decolonization. You can really see the limitations of the sort of promise of sovereignty and independence. And if all you are is a natural resource to the West, you're going to get fucked over at some point. So the sheikh class make a decision, which is we have to be known for and have value in some other way. And that's to do with diversifying the economy, and it's also to do with soft power. So it starts with transit, and it starts with the Emirates airline and the Etihad airline, turning Dubai and Abu Dhabi into these international transport hubs and a sort of gateway to Southeast Asia and to South Asia, and also to Australia and New Zealand as well. And then in the late 90s, early 2000s, we're going to be a tourist destination in our own right. So the Palm Islands, the Palm Jumeirah, all this, mega tasteful sort of building projects of high-rise hotels.
That's why I'm always considering investing.
That's why I'm always considering investing. That starts to be part of the strategy. And then afterwards, 2016 is a hugely impactful year for Dubai in particular, because they go, right, you've got all these Brits who can no longer, work and travel visa-free in 28 EU countries. Why don't we open our doors to them? And they made a concerted effort to attract influencers, people with, big social media followings, because they go, well, this is a way in which we can project soft power, literally, onto the phone screens of people all around the world. The flip side of that, it turns out, is that if you've got loads of influencers in Dubai or Abu Dhabi or wherever it is, and then they start filming like, oh no, the hotel's on fire, or like, oh shit, the, airport ceiling has just caved in, is that really undermines your work. So you're not necessarily going to die sitting in the Mall of the Emirates, but your chances of that happening now are significantly higher than they were 4 weeks ago. And the sort of central delusion of Dubai, which is we're in the Middle East, but we're not really. Right? We're more liberal in a sort of contained way. If you're not Muslim and you're from the West and you've got money, we're more liberal for you guys. And don't worry about what's across the Gulf, right? We can see Iran from our house. Don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. That is a illusion which took decades to construct. And how many bombs do you need before you stop feeling entirely safe, especially when most of the people living in Dubai and Abu Dhabi have passports of other countries? They could just go home And, I know that London is supposed to be a crime-ridden hellhole, but
yeah, maybe they'll come back
safer
now and realize it's not actually that crime-ridden. It's like crime is historically low. They're like, oh, God, I was in Dubai looking at all these horror videos about how everyone's getting stabbed in London all the time. And then I went back and actually it's fine. Maybe that's what Isabel Oakeshott will start.
Not that I would ever advocate people committing crime, but I'm going to be camped outside of Heathrow arrivals with an e-bike and a balaclava.
I was listening to it. I wanted to. I was trying to think what it was because I don't like to say I heard on a podcast without saying what the podcast was, but I just cannot remember what it was. But they were talking about. So if it was your podcast and you're watching, put it in the comments. I don't want to steal your ideas about credit, but they were having a conversation about whether this will destroy Dubai because influencers won't want to go there anymore. And the argument that was put forward is to say there's always going to be more influencers, like especially if you subsidize them to go there. And if no drones have hit a building in 6 months, I mean, not many people in these countries are going to die. So you're being there at the moment, you're not risking your life, really. It's more you're risking inconvenience. But they were saying the real barrier is going to be to long-term investments because, they're trying to attract billions to build data centers. And imagine just like you've got like a big box, very easily targeted by a drone with like millions and millions of pounds worth of chips inside, very easy to damage, very sensitive. So if they're trying to build this sort of diversified economy based on long-term investment, then that's why this is a disaster. Because, if this war ends at some point, probably you are going to be able to say, okay, well, probably the next 2 months do look safe. I can go out there and make some videos. I can go and live in a hotel for a year and, live tax-free, yada, yada, yada.
Bit cheaper, those hotels as well.
Yeah. But if you're saying, I want to make a 20-year investment in a place where a bunch of really expensive infrastructure has just been blown up, you're not going to want to do that anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a fair point. And so data centers have been a big part of this, like, let's diversify our economies for the Gulf states. And that's something which is going to be, potentially critically endangered. I mean, there is a sort of interesting thing of how short memories are. So I can't remember if this was 2021 or 2022, but it was around then. As you know, Michael, I watch Formula One, especially when the football is bad. I then switch over so that I can feel some joy. And it was the Saudi Arabia Grand Prix, I think it was in Jeddah, and all the Formula One drivers got stuck because the Houthis had successfully targeted a rocket at some Aramco facilities in Saudi Arabia. And as these, incredible feats of engineering were zooming around the track, you could see the plumes of smoke billowing from behind. And at that point, I sort of wondered, like, is this going to be a crisis for Saudi Arabia in particular in its program of sports washing? The great thing about the Formula One calendar is that you can really see which governments are like, come to us, come to us. Had Sochi for a while, not anymore. Baku, Jeddah, Bahrain, Abu Dhabi as well. But actually, it was sort of not a problem, right? So next year, Saudi Arabia Grand Prix comes back. It's not really an issue. But now, the next two, Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, have been cancelled from the calendar. Abu Dhabi is still on the calendar for the end of the year, but it means that the race season has been significantly shortened. And you just sort of go, like, how viable is that strategy going to be going forward for the Gulf states, right? Like, at the moment, they've just been sort of chucking money at sporting institutions, whether it's Formula One or whether it's WWE or whether it's comedians, being like, come make jokes, but just not our government, in Riyadh. It's a sort of thing of you go, all right, but when it's going to be increasingly uncertain whether or not these events can go ahead, like, it's not just the sort of like influencers aren't going to want to go there, but is that element of projecting power into the West, how viable is that going to be?
So you're having a terrible year because Tottenham might get relegated and all your favourite golf car races are going to be cancelled at the same time.
I actually think that the cancellation of these races could be to the benefit of the teams that I'm supporting. So the team I support is Mercedes. The driver that I like is Lewis Hamilton.
Oh, sorry, I got confused. I was like, how is Tottenham going to be connected to
this?
No, this makes sense.
So with a shorter race season, I think it could benefit them.
Okay.
Keep going is what I'm saying to the warmongers around the world.
Why would that... Do car racers get tired?
Well, yes. Fewer races means fewer opportunities to crash out. And so if you're in the lead with the points already, that's good. And then the second thing is that in between, I don't know why I'm talking about this. In between Grand Prix, there are significant improvements that can be made to a car. And they can make your car better or worse. Right? It's a gamble each time. So if you've got a good car at the start, you're kind of flying, you're having a great time. And Mercedes and Ferrari do this year.
Fabulous. Buy Mercedes and Ferraris. You heard it here. Well, you don't buy it. That's not how it works. But anyway, great cars. Great cars. Annelle Sheline is a former employee at the U.S. State Department who resigned in protest over U.S. support for the Gaza war. She's currently a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. She's an astute thinker and communicator. I originally got her on the first show we did after Trump and Israel launched their illegal war on Iran. And I caught up with her again on day 16 of the war for an update on how she's assessing what's happened since then. I started our conversation by asking whether she's been surprised by anything that's happened since we last spoke.
I mean, on the one hand, no one should have been surprised by the way this has played out. I think what's surprising is that we had a president and a U.S. administration that did not seem to understand the fact that these outcomes were entirely foreseeable. So just knowing that he launched this war on Iran apparently and has said himself that he was surprised that U.S. Arab partners, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, UAE, were angry at him for this. This is destroying their economies. That somehow he hadn't been briefed on the fact that that is obviously how they would feel. The impact this would have on the price of oil, subsequently the price of gasoline, the price of natural gas. All of these were completely foreseeable. In addition, the fact that war has been fundamentally transformed by these cheap and very effective drones. Trump ostensibly has been paying attention to the way the war in Ukraine is being fought, where drones have been arguably the most important aspect of that war, and yet somehow didn't make the connection that Iran has massive supplies of these very cheap drones that can only be brought down by these extremely expensive American interceptors that we already had a limited supply of these. So all of this to say that I'm just surprised to learn that the White House seems to be surprised by all of these elements that were completely foreseeable, to say nothing of the fact that sort of the nature of the Iranian regime, that it was not going to be a government that you could simply take out by taking out the supreme leader. I mean, Iran arguably has been preparing for this since last summer, but also for a generation, just knowing what their position was, sort of the mindset of that government. They have been putting contingency plans into place for just this scenario. And now we can see that they were prepared in a way that Trump and the United States clearly were completely unprepared.
You mentioned that the Gulf states being, annoyed that they've been put in this position. I'm still sort of unsure about where the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia stand, because the New York Times over the weekend had a report where they suggested that Trump is speaking all the time to Mohammed bin Salman, was the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, who is apparently telling him to keep hitting Iran hard. Obviously, it was the Gulf states who, well, Israel principally, but also the Gulf states who lobbied against Obama's nuclear deal. So is there an argument that actually this is, even if it's not good for them, it's what they asked for?
So I would be extremely skeptical of reporting from the New York Times, just given what we know about the makeup of their editorial board. And they're very pro-Israel bent. What I'm hearing from Saudi Arabia is that these are Israeli talking points to try to distribute the blame and to try to drag Saudi Arabia into the war, to get Iran to keep hitting them such that the Saudis subsequently must respond. Whereas they are really trying to stay out of it, to be, the Saudis, but all the Gulf states trying to make very clear that although they do have these US bases in their territory, that they are not allowing attacks to be launched from those bases, that they themselves are not using any of their own arsenals or weapons to fire at Iran, only trying to intercept incoming missiles and drones. You're certainly right that the Arab Gulf states and in particular the Saudis felt quite betrayed by the way that the Iran nuclear deal was negotiated. They felt excluded. They wanted to have been part of those negotiations, and they wanted it to address Iran's missile program. However, following the Iranian attacks on the Abqaiq oil facilities in 2019, when Trump responded by saying essentially, well, they hit Saudi Arabia, they didn't hit the US, and really had almost no reaction at all. That was a huge shock to the Saudis. And it was not the first time that they felt disappointed by the Americans' apparent unwillingness to live up to what they thought they'd been paying for all these years. Hundreds of billions of dollars in US armaments, in fighter planes. I mean, they've invested massively in the US military industrial complex, as well as the US economy. And they expected more of a response for all of that, all those investments. And so as a result, instead, they concluded that they couldn't rely on the Americans, and they worked to reduce tensions with Iran, which resulted in them normalizing relations in early 2023 in a deal that was guaranteed by China. And when I was in Saudi Arabia in December and was speaking with officials about this, including with officials who are extremely skeptical of Iran, as you said. I mean, there's no love lost there. They are quite, there's a degree to which they would prefer to see a less powerful Iran, but they had come to the conclusion that they can't change their geography. Iran is not going anywhere, and they are better served by an Iran that is not aiming its weapons at them, that feels more secure. I mean, their sort of worst case scenario is where we are now, where we're in a war, and whatever comes out of it, whether it's a more the U.S. definitively loses, and the Iranian regime is left intact, but is now dead set on a nuclear weapon, is more paranoid. I mean, the supreme leaders, father, mother, wife, and child were all killed by Israel / the United States. By placing him in charge, someone who otherwise would not have been likely a contender for this role of supreme leader. But that is a big middle finger to the United States to say, look, we're putting another Imam Ayatollah Khamenei in. You managed to replace one Ayatollah with his son, who is more of a hardliner, as obviously a very personal animus towards the U.S. and Israel now. So on the one hand, it's either this angry, paranoid Iranian regime that the whole Gulf has to deal with, or it's absolute chaos. If the U.S. is successful in sort of dismantling the Iranian government and Iran falls into chaos, then you have drug smuggling, human trafficking, refugees coming across the Persian Gulf, which is not that big of a body of water, and the Gulf states are completely opposed to that. So all this to say, I think this reporting from the New York Times that the Saudis are pushing for this, I think is a narrative that's being pushed by Israel, and it's trying to drag the Arab states into the war because Israel is hoping that Iran will shift its focus away from them and aim its missiles and drones at the Gulf states, because Israel's purposes would be well served by these countries fighting each other. And if Israel could sort of take a back seat, because we know that Israel is also running very low on these interceptors. And it's unclear how much longer they're going to be able to sustain this fight.
Yeah, that's interesting. Actually, I suppose also because one thing I've been thinking about is that, if this war is seen as a disaster in America, which widely it does seem to be sort of being interpreted as, and it's so openly something that the Israelis sort of tricked Trump into, then that is going to be very unhelpful for Israel standing in the United States. So if they can share the blame and make it seem like, it was also the Saudis who wanted this to happen, don't blame us. That makes some sense. I want to talk about the Strait of Hormuz, of course. Donald Trump asking allies and also China to come and help clean up his mess. Most of them have indicated they don't want to get involved. But even if they did, is there say that Britain, China, all these countries did decide, okay, Trump created the mess, but we are all suffering, so we will all try and help clean this up. Is there a military solution? Is there a way sort of short of a negotiated peace with Iran, that the Strait of Hormuz can be reopened?
I think the short answer is no, because, I mean, as you've indicated, we have many other countries that are not willing. I mean, at this point, the United States isn't willing to bring the U.S. Navy within range that could be struck by these Iranian drones and missiles. That would be a huge blow to America's image of, especially an aircraft carrier or something being taken down. And so no other country wants to be in that position either. I mean, these boats are extremely valuable. And the thought of losing one to help Trump, it's not as if Trump has conducted his foreign policy in a way that really any country feels particularly interested in making sacrifices on his part. So while it is accurate that a tanker alone is going to be more susceptible to being hit by a drone or missile than one that is accompanied by an armed ship that ostensibly could intercept that, it puts both ships would be extremely vulnerable still. I imagine people have seen some of those images of those very precise drones, like coming and taking out things like the massively expensive military radars in places like Bahrain. They're sort of slow moving. They're able to come in very precisely. The U.S. interceptors aren't necessarily built to. I mean, they can take out some of them, but also we're just running low on them. And so, while it is possible, as you said, that some countries may simply feel forced to try to do what they can to try to get some fuel through, because the alternative is no fuel. I suspect that most countries are really not keen to try to do that, given that it has a low chance of real success.
Yeah, that's such a good point, actually, because there's all this argument about whether or not the Europeans will join the Americans in trying to keep the Strait open. But as you say, the Americans aren't actually doing anything to keep the Straits open because they don't want their military to be subjected to the Shahed drone. So in a way, all of this is a sort of red herring, isn't it? Whether other countries will join the Americans, because the Americans aren't even doing it. Let's talk about sort of the rockets, the drones. And lots of people are sort of talking about this as a war of attrition. Who can sort out their supply lines first? Sorry. I suppose, is it the case that Iran is getting lots of their Shahed drones from China? I've been seeing sort of videos on social media of Chinese factories where they're creating what look like Shahed drones to go to Iran. Could that be, a pressure point at some point, or a China? If these drones are coming from China, are they happy to keep the Americans bogged down in the Middle East?
I haven't seen those videos, I'm not a military specialist, so I shouldn't claim expertise that I don't possess. However, just the question about would China be happy to see the U.S. remain bogged down in the Middle East? I mean, absolutely. This is certainly in China's interest, and it does also get to, as you said, a red herring that you hear about a lot when there's been this discussion for years since Obama about the United States ought to pivot to Asia, that the Middle East is really no longer such a strategic region as it once was. Certainly oil is important, but most Middle Eastern oil does flow east to China and other countries in Asia. And the United States at this point remains the largest producer of petroleum in the world, although it is obviously the U.S. economy is still very dependent on fossil fuel, and a spike in oil prices affects everyone. It doesn't matter that the U.S. is the largest producer. But still, this particular Middle Eastern oil is no longer so crucial to the U.S. economy as it was during things like the Gulf oil crisis in the 1970s, for example. But so this idea that if the U.S. pivoted to Asia, there would be a vacuum in the Middle East that China could then rush in to fill, China's just not interested. China doesn't extend security guarantees to other countries' security guarantees. I mean, clearly these are not actually very, very robust guarantees. If it's the United States that's being the actor in the region that's actually the source of the most instability and insecurity. But all that to say that China is not interested to replicate the mistakes of the United States by trying to take over the U.S. role in the Middle East. There's been some talk of whether Russia would be interested in doing that. I think at this point, Russia really has very little spare capacity given the war in Ukraine. And even so, I don't think Russia either would be interested in sort of trying to replicate American folly in the Middle East. But so yes, all that to say, I think China is quite pleased to see the U.S. Once again bogged down in an unnecessary war of choice in the Middle East.
The idea that Israel might imminently nuke Iran would once have sounded far-fetched. People who put forward that idea might also have just been seen as anti-Zionist agitators, exaggerating the extremity of Israeli politics. Now, though, that warning is coming directly from a Trump advisor, the billionaire tech investor David Sachs.
It's hard to know exactly how much damage Israel is taking right now. There's a social media blackout. But what you're starting to hear trickle out is that Israel is getting hit harder than they've ever been hit before in their history. And we're only 2 weeks into this. If this war continues for weeks or months, then Israel could just be destroyed. There are very large parts of it. Now, I think Israel is a harder target than the Gulf states. Their infrastructure is more hardened. Also, they're further away. The Gulf states are vulnerable to drones and short-range missiles, whereas Israel is mainly vulnerable to long-range missiles. Nonetheless, at some point, their air defenses could become exhausted if it hasn't happened already, and Israel could get seriously destroyed. And then you have to worry about Israel escalating the war by contemplating using a nuclear weapon, which would truly be catastrophic.
So the scenario he's putting forward is that the Iranians might, through a process of attrition, basically wear down Israel's missile defenses. So they're sort of getting hit to a degree they find unacceptable. And in response, Israel might resort to hitting Iran with a nuclear weapon. I mean, it's not totally clear what that would achieve. I suppose the idea is it would be like when the Americans bombed Japan and they said, okay, we're gonna give up because we can't have another city destroyed. Obviously, there would be big, I hope there would be big pushback from that. If we take the scenario seriously, though, it does seem like, part of what David Sachs was putting forward there is already happening. So this is from Semaphore on the weekend. The outlet has been told by US officials that Israel is running critically low on interceptors. And the article says this: Israel had reportedly entered the current war already low on interceptors that were fired during last summer's conflict with Iran. Israel's long-range defense system has strained under Iran's attacks. CNN reported that Iran was adding cluster munitions to its missiles, which may exacerbate the depletion of the stock. The US has been aware of Israel's low capacity for months. One US official said, "It's something we expected and anticipated." This official emphasized to Semaphore that the US is not running similarly low on interceptors of its own. That comment comes amid broader concerns about interceptor depletion from a longer military engagement in Iran, leaving the US in a poor position. Ash, I mean, it's kind of deja vu sort of when we were talking about Russia and Ukraine, because there was the moment where it looked like Russia were really losing the war. And everyone's saying, well, if Russia's losing the war and they're a nuclear power, are they going to nuke Ukraine to avoid defeat? And now it looks like, I don't know if we can say Iran are winning the war, but Iran are imposing higher costs than Israel probably imagined they would. Israel a nuclear power. So people are saying, well, maybe Israel are going to nuke Iran.
I mean, so there's quite a striking thing, which is that Russia didn't break the nuclear taboo. So that's still a very powerful deterrent to breaking with the status quo regarding the normalization of the use of nuclear weapons, right? They haven't been used since 1945. I think that what David Sachs was referring to is what's known as the Samson option. So that was a term that was popularized by Seymour Hersh, who wrote a book in 1991 called The Samson Option. And what he said is that it's part of Israel's military doctrine that if Israel were facing a credible threat to its very existence, it would, even if it meant the total annihilation of the state of Israel and its people, use nuclear weapons, making reference to the biblical story of Samson, who brought down the temple, even though it meant he was killed as well. And so I think David Sachs is sort of applying that idea of the Samson doctrine and saying, well, even if you're not looking at something like total annihilation of Israel, but Israel losing a conventional war, that might be a circumstance under which Israel decides to use nuclear weapons. Now, I don't want to jinx this, so I'm going to do some like knocking on wood and saying inshallah first. All right. Hopefully I'm right. I still think that the probability of Israel using nuclear weapons, if losing a conventional war, is relatively low. Because one, the nuclear taboo is still incredibly strong. And we don't know what the costs would be for breaking it. Now, Israel's been able to operate with impunity because it's been protected by the United States and its allies. Should it break the nuclear taboo, at the very least, the cooperation of the Gulf states would be no more. We've seen the cost that they've had to bear, just for housing American military bases and infrastructure. Their entire economy is looking like very shaky now because of being targeted by Iran. So you'd lose the cooperation of the Gulf states, maybe going as far as the use of airspace for interceptors to protect Israel from Iranian strikes. The second thing is you don't know what the punitive consequences from US, the EU, Western powers might be in terms of participation in the global economy. Israel is still it cannot exist without either the military aid or trading relationships it has with the West. You then have the issue of retaliatory strikes from Iran. So Iran, to the best of our knowledge, doesn't currently have a nuclear weapon. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have enough nuclear material to make something like a dirty bomb or have other weapons capable of significantly damaging Israel. And comments made by Stephen Witkoff, who's the US envoy to the Middle East, were really interesting. And I think this was made over the weekend. He said, Israel is a one-bomb country. It's geographically really small and its population is quite concentrated. It cannot withstand more than a single nuclear strike. Its nuclear capacity to be a second strike power, as it's known as, might still be intact, but its population and its ability to restore itself after a bomb wouldn't exist.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose my thing, I also think it's unlikely, but not so much because they would get nuked in response, because Iran don't have the nuclear bomb.
But a dirty bomb could do a huge amount
potentially.
of damage.
I suppose I don't know much about dirty bombs. I don't know how that would, how easy it is to convert their enriched uranium into a dirty bomb. But I suppose for me, I feel like if they broke the nuclear taboo, just the international consequences would be enormous. And I think so long as, if Israel is being, wildly genocidal in its own region, there are still enough global powers who feel like, well, that's over there. It doesn't really affect us. Yeah, we're not, we might say some tough words about Israel, but we're not going to expend any political capital sort of trying to isolate them. But if they were the first country to use a nuclear bomb since 1945, that would affect everyone very clearly. And I think there would have to be a very strong message from pretty much everyone to say you are being isolated. Maybe not Donald Trump as president. I mean, that would be worrying. But all the more sane, normal powers who, are willing to, because countries are generally quite self-interested, right? So it is very difficult to get, without a very long campaign, like there was in South Africa, them to take significant action to defend some people who aren't them. But I think, and that's why the Gaza genocide has sort of brought about such a weak reaction, really.
I mean, we've talked about this with relation to the Gaza genocide, which is, it's a mistake to think of Israel as irrational. Now, I think it is a reckless actor in that it seems, or the calculation being made by Netanyahu is that they don't really care about the cycle of escalation that it kicks off within the Middle East. And certainly the regard for the lives of their own citizens is fairly loose. They go, all right, well, it's worth it if we can significantly weaken Iran. So they might be reckless and certainly amoral with no regard for the rules of war or the Genocide Convention or human rights. But that doesn't mean they're irrational actors. And so I think that you have to view the breaking of the nuclear taboo as largely irrational. Because
they also did limit their action in Gaza. And that wasn't in a way to benefit the people of Gaza, because they killed, as many Palestinians in Gaza as they could. They killed many Palestinians in Gaza and didn't care about it, right, essentially. But their original plan was to kick all the Palestinians out of Gaza. And the reason they couldn't do that was because there are enough powerful countries who thought that would directly impact them, because they thought that if the Palestinians had been ethnically cleansed with the consent of a country like Egypt, then that would be so destabilizing to have all of those people in that country. So that's why that was stopped. So no one, like the red line for Israel in Gaza was never about the Palestinians. It was about how what they did to the Palestinians might have a broader regional impact, especially on US allies. So it's, I think the nuclear option is unlikely. But I mean, the fact it's sort of increasingly being talked about, very worrying. I'm going to have Daniel Levy on tomorrow, former negotiator for the Israelis, who we have on quite a lot, for the full hour. So I'll ask him in more detail what he thinks about, whether Israel would consider a nuclear option. For now, let's go back to David Sachs. I didn't tell you his exact job. He's Trump's special advisor for AI and crypto. It was a position which was created under Donald Trump. It didn't exist beforehand. He also co-chairs the President's Council of Advisors on Science and Technology. He is clearly at this point a faction within the Trump administration who wants this war to end soon, as he explained in the rest of that clip.
There's a lot of scenarios here, a lot of really frightening scenarios about where escalation could lead. And even though the United States is a much more powerful country than Iran, they essentially have a dead man's switch over the economic fate of the Gulf states, and even potentially beyond that, the habitability of some of these countries. So I do tend to think that this is a good time to declare victory. I think, Brad, you're right that the president has never said that democracy promotion is one of his objectives. Yes, JCal, obviously everyone would welcome if the people rose up and chose a new regime, but that's not something that we've said we have to accomplish. And this would be a really good time to take stock of where we are and try, I think, to seek an off-ramp. And look, if escalation doesn't lead anywhere good, then you have to think about, well, how do you de-escalate? And de-escalation, I think, involves reaching some sort of ceasefire agreement or some sort of negotiated settlement with Iran. And we can get into more of what that looks like. But I think that's the big picture, is that if escalation could lead in all these horrifying directions, and I think that's not the right approach. You have to look at de-escalation.
I mean, there clearly is a faction within Trumpism that thinks this was a disaster. I suppose it's probably the more business-minded element, right, that thinks this is a complete disaster because of the economic impacts it's having. Trump has responded to Sachs' comments. He was asked about them at a press conference today.
One of your advisors, David Sachs, said the other week that the U.S. should, quote, declare victory and get out of the Iran war. He also warned that if the conflict escalates, Israel may contemplate the use of a nuclear weapon. Has he shared that assessment with you?
No, he hasn't. Israel wouldn't do that. Israel would never do that. And there's a theory. You pounded them to hell and you could just leave now, and it'll take 10 years for them to build back not nearly what they have right now. And I guess that's another theory.
So it's Trump there sounding like he wouldn't let Israel use a nuclear weapon. And also, he does want to he's like, well, he wants to declare victory and leave. The question is that even possible at this point in time?
Well, yeah, I mean, who knows what Trump's understanding of the situation was before he did it, all right? And to what extent he was effectively bounced into it by Netanyahu. But there's certainly a self-interest of a prolonged war with significant American casualties, and worse still, the potential for terrorist attacks on American soil, would be hugely, hugely unpopular. And he has decried Democrats like Kamala Harris, Joe Biden, and Barack Obama for being warmongers. And that's not because I think that Trump has a real commitment to peace. I mean, the FIFA Peace Prize, unfortunately, did not stay his hand. But it's because he has an understanding that the Iraq War and the wars on terror represented a sort of fundamental and irreparable breach between government and the American people, right? The same way that they have here. So he wants an easy win and to be like, yep, I'm done, like he was able to do with Venezuela. But that's not like Iran. One, I think that there are questions about was there a degree of insider cooperation with the kidnapping of Maduro? I think that's a relevant and an appropriate question to ask. And the second thing is that Iran has had ample time to prepare for this war. So since Donald Trump unilaterally scrapped the nuclear treaty, Iran has known that a war will come at some point. So just because Donald Trump wants to extricate himself doesn't mean that they have any interest to. And after both Netanyahu and Trump have completely destroyed any trust or like basic credibility with the negotiation process, what's the off-ramp? What does it look like?
Well, I think that's what's scariest about this moment, though, because either Israel and the US managed to make some kind of deal which doesn't significantly, because Iran is not going to, on the basis of this, sign a nuclear agreement like the ones that were on offer. Yeah, because they'll say, well, last time we were negotiating this, you just bombed us again. Like they are, if this regime stays intact, they're going to go nuclear. It would be totally rational for them. But then the problem with that is that it's very, if you take on the regime but don't destroy them, you've just made the situation more dangerous, which, I think it would be better for, I think it would be better for Iran to get a nuclear bomb than for Israel and the United States to destroy Iran's state capacity and make it a failed state in an endless civil war. But if those are the two options, I think, the Americans and the Israelis are going to pick the latter. I mean,
there might be a third option, which is a kind of frozen conflict. Right. So that might be a sort of like non-negotiated, but like non-escalatory way out. And that doesn't look like peace.
But the moment you freeze the conflict, they're going to go nuclear.
Well, I mean, that is a rational decision. Do you know what I mean? Like I don't know about you, Michael, but for me, probably the most significant, profound change in my politics over the past 12 months has been, I was pretty like non-proliferation by any means necessary, right? Like every single nuke which is taken out of the world makes the world safer. And I still believe that from the perspective of the human species. But I don't see how any head of state at the moment can say unilateral non-proliferation is safe or thinks it's a rational decision to not pursue either nuclear weapons of your own or some kind of defense pact with a nuclear power after what America and Israel has done. I mean, look, there's a reason why they're not invading North Korea, right?
And also, they're not, the whole point was I don't want to sound complacent here, but the whole point of North Korea is that if they get nukes, this is crazy people with nuclear weapons and they're going to kill us all. Like they got nukes and all that happened is, I don't think they're having a good time in North Korea. Like North Korea is not a lesson of, a society or country I want to see, but ultimately they got their nuclear bomb and they keep themselves to themselves and no one invades them. So sort of like maybe if Iran gets the nuclear bomb, they just have a nuke, they keep themselves to themselves and no one invades them. I mean obviously the logical conclusion of that is every country gets a nuclear weapon, which would be very dangerous, especially because that increases the chances of like an accidental launch, which is, as far as I understand, the closest we ever got to nuclear war was a series of misunderstandings. The more countries have nukes, the more misunderstandings you might get.
Fabulous book about nuclear accidents by Eric Schlosser called Command and Control, which is about broken arrows. So the sort of lost and accidentally dropped nuclear bombs that have occurred throughout history. Like, completely agree with you. That's the scarier thing. And agree with you that like the two options are like a set of circumstances in which Iran pursues the bomb. And the other part of it is that if you're Russia and you go, all right, well, how do I look at the balance of power here? War has, one, reopened to some degree international markets for oil. And two, it's snarled up America and the West's attention in the Middle East again. So no one's really looking at Ukraine. Is that you also have the option of, okay, well, what if we shared more nuclear information with Iran? Right, like that's another element of it. So, in terms of what a course of action is, which is like seemingly designed for maximum instability and like worst possible outcome, I think Trump scrapping the nuclear treaty in 2016, was kind of like the original sin.
Lots of people in the comments saying, "Stop calling Iran a regime." I would defend that, because when you say the government in this country, you're talking about a very specific organization, which is the cabinet, right? It's a group of people who can get replaced at the next election. The police will stay the same. The judiciary will stay the same. The army will stay the same. So it is, the regime in Britain is the government plus parliament plus the police force plus the army plus the judiciary. So it's all of that is the regime. So when we get to a general election, we're not talking about replacing the regime. We're talking about replacing the government. In Iran, if it's not just going to be the case that, you know, that the Ayatollah goes and then they get a new, sort of a completely new government and everything stays the same. It's all or nothing, right? Either if the government of Iran collapses, then the army, the judiciary, that all changes. So that's why I do think it does make sense to say regime. It doesn't have to be morally loaded, but when you're talking about, you're not just talking about the Iranian government, which is sort of the political leadership, because it all comes as a package, because you don't have the same sort of division of powers that you have here. Any opinions on regimes versus governments?
I've gotten too hungry to be able to focus.
All
I can't lie.
Let's wrap up. Ash, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
You're not going to see me for a little while, Michael. I'm going to be away from Novara for a month. I'm going on holiday to Dubai, actually. I heard it's nice this time of year. No, I'm going on...
Cut price hotel rooms.
Super cheap. I'm going on a real holiday. So if you don't hear from me for a month, I'm fine. I haven't died. I'm just trying to enjoy myself.
I'm going to miss you.
I'm going to miss you too.
It's going to be terrible. It's going to be a disaster. I hope you still watch, though. You know, even it's still worth tuning in at least some of the time if Ash isn't here, I hope.
Also, keep Michael company.
Keep me company, please. I'm desperate. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in. Come back tomorrow for another live stream from 6 p.m. For now, you've been watching Novara Media. Good night.